Daniel Markovits, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me here. It's a real pleasure.
Thank you very much. You are a law professor at the Law School of Yale, and you're also a researcher in various fields, including behavioral economics and political philosophy.
Yes.
Your new book, The Meritocracy Trap, questions the myth of meritocracy in the United States. But first of all, in the recent years, we have seen a dramatic rise in inequalities in some countries like the US. But the way you measure it and the way you explain it is very different from the one of the French economist French Piketty. Why do you have a different appreciation of the allocation of labor and share?
Great. So Piketty's story is one that focuses on an increased capital intensiveness of income and an increased concentration of capital in the rich. So the idea is that income becomes more dependent on capital rather than labor, and capital is concentrated in a few households, and you get the rise of the 1%. That story, I think, is overwhelmingly persuasive for many parts of the world, in particular for France, also for Germany. The story in the United States is a little bit different, and Piketty himself, if you read him closely, acknowledges this. He says up to about 2000, the increase in the US top 1% income share comes from elite labor, not so much from elite capital. But since 2000, Piketty thinks capital is back in the US also. And that's the place at which I disagree with Piketty a little bit. In particular, there are two kinds of sources of disagreement. One is conceptual. It has to do with how you allocate income between capital and labor. There's lots of income that goes to people in the form of capital, stock options, returns to pensions, appreciation of real estate, but whose origins are in the labor of the person who earns it. So the CEO of a company in the US today gets paid roughly half of her income in stock options, but she gets paid only for her labor. A hedge fund manager's carried interest is capital income, but it's paid for labor. So I would allocate that income to labor, not to capital. There's also a question of how you look at the data. There's lots of income that the tax returns report as capital income, but which is probably in fact labor income. Founders' shares for entrepreneurs, carried interest for hedge fund managers is reported as capital gains. But again, it's really morally labor income. And it's very hard to figure out from the data how much of these categories of income are labor. But to give you an idea, carried interest probably accounts for roughly 20 times as great a share of capital gains today as it did 2 decades ago. So for that reason, I think all in all, even today in the US, the top 1%'s income is probably 2/3 to 3/4 labor income. And even the top 0.1%'s income is probably 2/3 labor income. And that's a difference from Piketty. It's a US specific difference.
Yeah. And can you describe a little more, because it's also in the core of your book, who are these people? You describe some of the jobs they made. Who are these people who are the elite of labor?
Yeah, so the labor elite is becoming so narrow and income is becoming so concentrated that you can actually understand this phenomenon as a journalist and not just as an academic. So if you look at, for example, lawyers who work for law firms whose profits per partner are greater than $400,000 a year. Or if you look at professionals in the finance industry, or specialist doctors, or people whose title is vice president or above at S&P 1500 companies. So these are known people with named jobs, and that group together accounts for probably half to 3/4 of the 1%. And again, you know that that's labor income because you know how these people get their incomes.
Even if it's paid in capital.
Even if some of it is paid in capital. That's exactly right.
How do you join the club of this elite labor?
So the story of the book, and here I think Piketty and I agree entirely about the dynastic and unjust quality of this concentration of wealth, is that to join the club, you need from birth through adulthood massive investments in your training, in your education, in your human capital. You need to go to distinctive schools as a 3-year-old, and then distinctive primary schools, and then distinctive high schools, and then distinctive universities and distinctive professional schools. A firm like Goldman Sachs recruits almost exclusively at Yale, Harvard, Princeton, Stanford, MIT, and maybe one or two other places. If you look at the most profitable law firm in the United States today, profits per partner, by the way, more than $5 million a year. I think 80 to 85% of the partners at that law firm attended just 5 law schools. So again, you have to go to the poshest universities, and those are very expensive. Those are extremely expensive. And one way to think about this is if you take the difference between the amount that a rich family invests in sending its children to those schools each year and the typical amount that a middle-class child has invested in its education. And every year you took that amount and put it in the S&P 500 to give it as an inheritance to the child when the parents died. That would be about $10 million per child. So it's a huge, what I call meritocratic inheritance, which is the economic and social equivalent of the aristocratic inheritance that rentier elites have always had. And it's a way in which rich families become dynasties.
And at Yale University, you have a good point of view on this, but we speak a lot about positive discrimination. That means that it's only a marketing argument for these elite universities?
To say it's only a marketing argument is maybe a little too strong. It is true that if you take Harvard, Princeton, Yale, and Stanford together, they have more students whose parents are in the top 1% of the income distribution than in the entire bottom 60%. So these universities overwhelmingly educate very rich people. They also try, I think genuinely, to draw in students from less wealthy households. The problem is that because the education system is so biased towards wealth all the way throughout, from birth through 20, it's very, very hard for the universities to find students who have had the educations that they need to succeed once they get to an elite university, who aren't themselves from wealthy households. So the system of inequality sort of propagates all through the society, and to fix it, the whole society needs to change, not just one institution.
So you show that education works, but only works for the little, and so that's why you say that meritocracy is a sham at the end.
Yes, so another reason why I say meritocracy is a sham is that there is a connection between elite education and the existence of the jobs that pay so much. So think about finance for a moment. Think about home mortgage finance. This is the sector of the economy that shifts resources from savers to borrowers in order to allow people to live in houses that they can't afford except out of future income. In the 1970s, the central production worker in finance, in home mortgage finance, was the loan officer. This was a mid-skilled, middle-class worker. Did not go to a fancy university, was paid a middle-class wage, but was not very rich. Today, the loan officer has been completely de-skilled in the United States. This is somebody who fills in forms. The forms are processed by a computer. The loans are no longer serviced by the bank that originates them. Instead, they're securitized. And the central worker is no longer the loan officer, but the derivatives trader and the finance technician. And those are super skilled elite people. Now, the best economic evidence by Philippon and Reshef suggests that the old style of finance was just as economically efficient as the new style. So the choice is between delivering a service using a large number of middle-class workers or delivering effectively the same service using a few very elite workers and a rump of unskilled workers. And we've shifted from the first model to the second. The reason why we've shifted from the first model to the second is the existence of the super skilled workers. So the existence of this narrow elite of intensely trained people creates the demand for its skills, which then makes them so highly paid. So when they say that they deserve what they're paid because they're so productive, the only reason they're so productive is that there's so much inequality. And that's the sense in which meritocracy is a sham. It's that the thing it calls merit is an artifact of the inequality that it wants to justify. And that argument is a circular argument and can't justify inequality.
And in this situation, what would you say, what could be the solutions? There are structural problems in economy, in higher educations. Do you have any way to go out of this situation?
So I think there are two kinds of solutions, and they need to attack the labor market and the education system. Start with the education system. Right now in the United States, there is an enormous implicit subsidy for elite education. Elite universities are treated as charities and therefore tax exempt, which means that alumni donations are tax deductible to the alumni, and the universities can invest their endowments without regard to taxation. At the moment, a university like Yale has an endowment between 20 and 30 billion US dollars. This subsidy should not be paid to the universities, or to elite private schools for that matter, unless the universities and the private schools start educating a broader swath of the population. So throughout the education system, the tax system should refuse to treat institutions as charities that don't actually serve the public good, should require these institutions to admit something like half of their students from the bottom 2/3 of the income distribution, and that would enormously increase the supply of elite labor. The universities could double their enrollments and would suppress the wages of elite workers and create much more opportunity. On the labor market side, there are a whole series of labor market policies that could be adopted that would prefer middle class over elite labor. Right now, again, the tax system prefers elite labor. Most importantly, the wage tax, which is not the income tax in the United States, which is connected to Social Security, is roughly speaking a 10 percentage point penalty on middle class workers as compared to super elite workers. That should be ended. There should be a tax incentive for hiring middle class workers. Wage subsidies for middle class workers would increase middle class employment. And then there are a whole series of regulatory schemes that could, for example, favor providing health care using nurses rather than doctors, favor providing legal services using paralegals rather than lawyers, favor providing finance using Main Street local banks versus global financial institutions. So there are regulatory reforms which in sector after sector after sector could prefer the middle class over the elite, whereas now the regulatory framework in fact prefers the elite over the middle class. And these two reforms together will reinforce each other and can start unwinding the ratchet that we've seen building up this elite labor inequality.
And you think you could revive the American dream in that way?
I hope. You know, if you look across space and time, there are vanishingly few societies that have experienced as great a concentration of income and wealth at the very top as the United States has today, and have not ended in a revolution or losing a war. The most prominent example, as it happens, is the United States in the 1920s. So there is a historical precedent for unwinding this kind of inequality in the United States. But it's a narrow precedent, and it requires a massive political investment, both in the politics of getting together a movement that can sustain these reforms, and then in the policy of actually implementing the reforms.
Daniel Markovits, thank you very much for coming on Xerfi Canal, presenting your new books, The Meritocracy Trap.
Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure. I'm grateful.
Thank you.